Let me, okay. Can everyone see the slides properly? Okay.
Perfect.
All right. Let me just adjust um, there we go. Okay. All right, so I'll get started. So as Helen mentioned, my name is Sae. I'm currently at a small science and technology university called Pohang University of Science and Technology at Post-Tech in South Korea. And today I'm going to share with you some of the work that I've been doing in the past several years with my students to understand atmosphere and snowpack mercury exchange in mid-latitude region. And please let me know if I'm too quiet or if I need to speak up. Okay, so I'm actually a little unconventional, but I'm going to get straight into the site description because everyone's probably wondering why are we looking at mercury exchange between atmosphere and snowpack in mid-latitude region, right? So just to situate you guys, at South Korea, we're sort of sticking out a little bit. Sorry, I'll also get a pointer out, sorry. Um, there we go. Okay. So we're sticking out a little bit from China here. So North Korea, South Korea here. And in the bottom of South Korea, there is an island called Jeju. Here, it's basically a volcanic island. It's a pretty remote site because there are no anthropogenic sources that can emit mercury into the environment. And it's basically been designated as a background site in Southeast Asia for multiple scientific purposes. So, one of the studies that are ongoing is this ENET, Acid Deposition Monitoring Network in East Asia, where a lot of the monitoring data on acid rain are coming from this location. The mountain that is located right in the middle of Jeju Island is the one that's called Mountain Hala. And this is basically has been our study site where we characterized mercury exchange between the atmosphere and snowpack. So here, you probably have a lot of questions why we have chosen this site. There are multiple reasons. First, essentially, COVID started when my student Ju Hyun, who's currently a postdoc at Harvard, started to join our lab, and she was really passionate about looking into this mercury exchange between the atmosphere and snowpack in the Arctic region. We were fortunate enough to get a small funding to go to the Arctic and study mercury cycling, but that never happened because of the COVID. So we've basically decided that we're going to go to the snowiest region of South Korea, which happens to be Mountain Hala. So this is the mountain. The highest elevation is 1900 meters, although most people reach up to 1700 meters. I'll just go back quickly, but this is where you can find these emergency stations where there's electrical outlet, where people generally climb up to. So this has been our main monitoring site. But you can basically see during the winter, it snows pretty heavily here, and you can see that it looks very different from the conventional or different other regions of South Korea, where it snows approximately 10 days during the entire winter time. Here, instead, it snows every week, basically. And once it snows, we get an accumulation of a meter or up to 2 meters of snow. So it has been a really good site for us to study this mercury cycling, which kind of mimics the Arctic environment during the winter time. So since 2020, we've started to visit the mountain every winter time for 4 years. And the first couple of years, all we did was we went to the site and collected some snow, collected some atmospheric samples to run for concentrations and characterize mercury isotopes in these samples. But basically the research got a little further and expanded where we now have an installation of TechRAN, which can measure mercury speciation in the atmosphere at minutes to hours of duration. We've also designed the snow flux chamber, which we can utilize to look at mercury photo reduction processes within the snow without further deposition. And then obviously the high volume samplers and TGM samplers, which we utilize to characterize mercury isotopes in these samples. There are also other reasons. I mean, we basically started this research with a very simple question. Obviously, we couldn't go to the Arctic, and the first question that we had in mind was how similar is Mountain Hala with the Arctic in terms of mercury sources and cycling pathways, right? Really simple question. We wanted to compare these two different sites in terms of the sources of mercury that are coming in and how mercury cycles or exchanges between the atmosphere and the snowpack. More specifically, we wanted to see whether we could characterize various mercury sources that are coming into Mountain Hala, which is characterized as a remote mid-latitude region in Asia. So the hypothesis was in this remote site, we could get three different mercury sources that are coming into Mountain Hala. One is probably this long-range mercury transport, which could have some anthropogenic signals, right? From mainland Korea or from China. The other sources is the re-emissions of mercury from the snowpack as well as re-emissions from the ocean because basically the island is completely surrounded by the ocean and mercury being the only volatile heavy metal can be subjected to these re-emission processes basically. The other question that we had was, what is the dominant atmospheric mercury removal processes and is it similar to the Arctic? So again, it is surrounded by this coastal region. So you could get a lot of sea salt aerosols or halogens that can quickly scavenge mercury in the atmosphere and lead to rapid oxidation and deposition to the Mountain Hala site, which is something that we typically observe in the Arctic. And obviously, being a high altitude site, we could also get the influences of halogens from the troposphere. And I know that there are some papers that are suggesting that sea salt aerosol debromination in the troposphere can generate bromine radicals that can induce mercury oxidation and deposition as well. So we wanted to see whether we could pick up these signals, especially by measuring mercury stable isotopes. So just to quickly introduce you to my research lab, these are all of my students, which they all look a little weird because this is the photo which we took over Halloween party. But essentially, all we do is use this one single tool called mercury stable isotopes to understand sources and natural or biogeochemical processes, even in contaminated sites, using the measurement of mercury stable isotopes at various environmental compartments, whether that's in the Arctic, Antarctic regions, in the ocean, atmosphere, forest, and contaminated sites. So before I get into a brief introduction of the mercury isotope system, I want to go briefly through just general overview of mercury. So this is showing you mercury sources and fluxes on a global basis. So first, you can see that there are natural and anthropogenic sources that can emit mercury into the environment. There are various geogenic or natural sources, including volcanic emissions, hydrothermal vents, or even natural weathering that can release mercury as this gaseous elemental form into the atmosphere. The other process or activities that can emit mercury is through anthropogenic activities. And we know that there are over 20 anthropogenic sectors, including coal-fired power plant, smelting, waste incineration, that can emit mercury into the atmosphere. Although both of these sources typically emit mercury as this gaseous elemental form, anthropogenic activity is the only one that can emit mercury as gaseous oxidized species as well as particulate-bound form of mercury, which we call it PBM. And obviously, mercury, once it is emitted in the atmosphere, it can cycle and then deposit into the biosphere and even in the ocean. Again, one of the most interesting features about mercury is that because it is the only volatile heavy metal, it can be quickly re-emitted into the atmosphere from natural re-emission processes. So biomass burning here, I guess, could be considered as a re-emission process, but re-emissions from soil, vegetative surfaces, snowpack, and ocean re-emission, all these encompass a great amount of mercury flux into the atmosphere. And this is why we've sort of have this international agreement to mitigate mercury emissions and to reduce human mercury exposure. In compared to this global fluxes and sources, Arctic has unique cycling processes, and I think that has to do with the presence of a snowpack. Obviously, there are a few other aspects that are interesting, but here, what I'm showing you is that mercury, one of the most unique cycling pathways in the Arctic is atmospheric mercury depletion event. And I'm sure some of you guys are already familiar with this term, but it's a depletion event that occurs during polar sunrise. So we get this long-range transport of mercury, generally the one that's evaded naturally from the ocean surfaces is the one that binds quickly with the halogens and then deposit onto the snowpack. But because, again, mercury is so volatile, the sunlight induces photoreduction of this gaseous or gaseous oxidized mercury species back into the elemental mercury form. And it basically causes this recycling process that occurs really rapidly. The other pathway in which mercury can deposit into the snowpack, and typically during the nighttime or before the polar sunrise, is that gaseous elemental mercury can basically just go through the pore spaces of the snow and become oxidized with oxidants that might be present within the snow. So it could be halogens and it could be other forms of oxidants, but it will basically lock up mercury into this oxidized mercury form. And this is something that is typically, again, observed during the nighttime or prior to or polar dark season. And I'm here to convince you that we can use mercury stable isotopes to basically distinguish these complex processes and sources in the Arctic or wherever there is a snow. So just to briefly go through the mercury stable isotope system, we have 7 stable isotopes for mercury ranging from 196 to 204, and we typically use 202 and 199 to represent mercury isotope ratios in environmental samples. One of the interesting features is obviously that mercury sources or different environmental samples, so whether that's sediment or samples from the atmosphere, have relatively distinct isotope ratios. And this is why we can use mercury isotope ratios to decipher sources that are emitted into the environment, as well as sources that may be responsible for contamination. So the example that I'm showing you here is that we know that precipitation that is impacted by coal-fired power plant typically have this very negative mercury isotope value relative to precipitation that is unimpacted by anthropogenic activities. And what we can do is that by knowing these end members, we can we can calculate the contribution of these sources using what's known as isotope mixing model. So these are the end members, as I mentioned. So one that's heavily impacted by coal-fired power plant, one that's a background mercury, basically. And if we have this value in some sort of a sample, we can basically attribute the percentages. The other unique features about mercury is that it can undergo fractionation through 2 different types of pathways. So mass-dependent fractionation is basically similar to light isotope systems such as carbon and nitrogen in that it fractionates mass dependently. So it's basically a similar concept to any other isotope system. And we generally use delta 2 to mercury value to represent mass-dependent fractionation. This guy basically fractionates through all known mercury biogeochemical processes. It's very sensitive. So we generally don't utilize delta 2 to mercury to distinguish mercury sources in the environment. But luckily, we have mass-independent fractionation, and this guy is way more conservative. They're conservative in that it can only fractionate or changes of these 199 mercury isotopes occur only through photoreduction or photodegradation of inorganic or methyl mercury. So if there are no photochemical processes, obviously we have very conserved values that cycles in the environment, and we can use that value to trace mercury sources. The other interesting fact is that photooxidation can also induce fractionation, but the difference between photoreduction and oxidation is that reduction induces fractionation in these odd number isotopes. So you can see 199 and 200 are the only isotopes that will undergo fractionation through photoreduction. 200 and 204, which are the even number isotopes, will undergo fractionation through photooxidation processes in the atmosphere. So just to quickly summarize, this is how we typically plot mercury isotope values of all environmental samples. So on the x-axis, we have delta 2 to mercury values representing mass-dependent fractionation. So this changes in x-axis will happen through all different types of biogeochemical processes. And some of the examples that I'm showing you here is microbial methylation of mercury. Binding or sorption processes will also cause fractionation to more negative value. Evaporation or microbial demethylation will cause shifts to more positive values. And these are, again, just examples. On the y-axis, we have Cap-199 mercury values representing mass-independent fractionation through photochemical reduction processes, right? So when methyl mercury and inorganic mercury undergoes photoreduction, we get this elevated Cap-199 mercury value. So you can imagine that most samples will plot on this axis, right? But whenever there's photoreduction processes, then we'll start to have values that are more elevated on the y-axis. And I'll start to highlight some of the processes that may be unique for the Arctic environment. So this one I'm going to ignore for a second because it's a process that occurs within a fluorescent light bulb, which is a little irrelevant to natural setting. But here you can see that the photochemical reduction within the snow basically generates a completely opposite direction of this mass-independent fractionation. So this is when things happen, the photoreduction happens in aqueous solution. When photoreduction occurs in snow, we get very depleted 199 mercury value. This is very unique to the snow phase, right? And most samples won't plot on this negative axis, which is very unique to what signals that we may observe in the Arctic environment. The other interesting thing about mercury isotope is that, as I mentioned, the even mass number isotopes, such as 200 and 204, will only undergo fractionation through photooxidation processes. What it's currently regarded is that when photooxidation occurs in the troposphere, so at a higher altitude region, we get this significant fractionation of even mass number isotopes. So this is mercury zero that's floating in the atmosphere. And when this mercury undergoes photooxidation through what's hypothesized as through intense UV radiation, as well as these oxidants such as ozones and halogens that are present in the troposphere, we get this very elevated mercury 2 plus or oxidized mercury form that has more positive 200 value and more depleted 204 value. So again, this is still debatable, this process, and it'll probably need more experimental work. But knowing that bromine in the troposphere acts as an important oxidant in the Arctic, this is something that we can also try to utilize to see where oxidation may be taking place. On the flip side, so if oxidation in the troposphere causes significant fractionation, the question is, what if oxidation occurs in the near surface environment, right? What my student here, Singhyun, has recently found was that when oxidation occurs at a near surface environment, there is no fractionation. So when mercury zero undergoes oxidation and it converts into mercury 2 plus, it'll basically preserve this negative 200 and positive 204 values, even upon oxidation process. And this is something that we typically observe during AMD processes or atmospheric mercury depletion events, where the oxidation occurs only a few meters above the snowpack. Aerosol scavenging, if it occurs below the troposphere near the marine boundary layer, it'll also preserve this negative values, right? If mercury zero undergoes dissolution in the seawater, and also vegetative sequestration, where mercury zero enters the stomata of a foliage and becomes locked. This is also characterized as a near surface oxidation. And all these processes will essentially preserve this negative value of mercury zero. So, knowing these as potential tracers for oxidation sources or photoreduction pathways, we basically try to characterize or sample snow as well as atmospheric samples in Mountain Hala and try to compare it with the Arctic environment. So first thing that I'm showing you here is the snow mercury concentration. And here I'm just basically throwing out the conclusion. It's basically similar to the Arctic environment, especially during the AMDE. So the red bars are the mercury concentrations, which we evaluated in snow in Mountain Hala site. And we just plotted this by different elevation, which doesn't seem to vary or by elevation. But what I'm showing you here is basically the concentrations seem to be a little higher or similar to snow from the Arctic during the AMD season, showing pretty much elevated concentrations. And then these are the snowpack that were sampled either in the non-Arctic region, such as Michigan, and or in the Arctic region during non-AMD season. Obviously, there's a one location which seems to have extremely elevated mercury concentration during AMD, but I don't know if this is a typical trend or if this is an anomalous trend. But essentially, what we're showing you is that the concentrations were pretty high in the snowpack in Mountain Hala. Same thing for the inorganic ions that we measured in snow samples. So here we sampled, we measured bromine, chlorine, sodium, magnesium, calcium, potassium, and well, also a few anthropogenic compounds. What I'm also again showing you is that the values that we recorded in the snow in Mountain Hala were comparable with a lot of the Arctic regions where sea salt aerosol seems to play an important role. Obviously, the anthropogenic pollutants were much more elevated at our site compared to remote Arctic region. Before showing you the stable isotope mercury's for stable isotope ratios of mercury in snow, I'm just going to give you a refresher, right? So this is what happens in the snowpack, which we typically observe very negative 199 value when mercury undergoes photoreduction within the snowpack. And this is a paper that was summarized by Douglas and Bloom in 2019. But essentially, what they're showing you here is that when mercury zero, that is measured at Barrow, Alaska, is initially oxidized and deposited onto snowpack during AMD season, we get this initial negative value in 199. And as snowpack ages, meaning that there's substantial photo reduction or evasion of gaseous elemental mercury back into the atmosphere, we get this very depleted 199 value, which seems to be consistent with this experimental value, obviously. What's really interesting is that when mercury zero undergoes what's known as reactive surface uptake, so this is the one that I explained as when mercury zero enters the pore spaces of snow and gets locked up during polar dark season or during the nighttime, we get a completely different isotopic pattern where we sustain 199 value, but we get much more negative delta 2 to mercury value in the remaining snow. And this is not just snow, but this a similar pattern basically occurs in vegetation, where when mercury zero enters the stomata of a foliage and gets locked in and oxidized. So here, this gives us a really nice illustration that if we characterize mercury isotopes in snowpack, we can basically understand how mercury enters the snow and undergoes certain processes. So when we looked at the mountain hollow snow, we basically saw a very similar pattern to the Arctic when there was an AMDE or photo reduction within the snowpack. So here, all the circles are the snowpacks that we characterized in Mountain Hala. They are colored by different days, but essentially as the day ages, you can see that there is a depletion in 199 mercury value, showing that mercury photoreduction may be playing an important role in this pattern, even in Mountain Hala. The gray diamonds that I'm showing you here are the particulate bound mercury, so mercury that is bound in aerosols or particles, and these values seems to overlap with the fresh snow that has recently deposited to Mountain Hala. So we're assuming that this PBM likely plays a dominant role as a source to the snowpack. Something that we use to confirm the presence of photoreduction that's driving the negative 199 mercury value is that we also installed a flux chamber to see how much mercury is being evaded into the atmosphere from snowpack by a different diurnal cycle. So on the x-axis, I'm showing you the time series. On the y-axis, I'm showing you mercury zero fluxes. But you can see that the fluxes generally correlate with the solar radiation of that particular time period for all the snow measurements that we've conducted. This is a soil flux that we measured. We basically removed snow and then try to measure whether there are equivalent fluxes of mercury from soil. And you can see that there are almost zero mercury fluxes from snow during the diurnal cycle, where snow obviously undergoes substantial photoreduction processes. So what starts to look different from the Arctic. So far up to here, everything seems to look like that there is the isotope patterns that we observe in Mountain Hala is comparable with the Arctic environment. But what's different from the Arctic is the sources of mercury zero or gaseous elemental mercury that is present in the ambient Mountain Hala site. So here, the purple triangles are the gaseous elemental mercury isotopes that which we characterized at Mountain Hala at different periods. Generally, so this square is gaseous elemental mercury that was characterized in Alaska. You can see that the ranges are very narrow, right? The source is pretty much the one that's evaded from the ocean, and it's very consistent during the AMD season, whereas in Mountain Hala, we get a really wide range. When we compare these values with the inventory, which I published in 2020, you can see that there could be mixtures. So it's basically the Mountain Hala mercury zero plotting over here. And it's basically representing mixtures of some anthropogenic mercury sources that may have transported from long distances, possibly from mainland Korea or China. And also it overlaps somewhat with the ocean or snowpack evaded mercury sources, which are shown in this gray boxes. This is the background mercury source. They generally have a slightly negative 199 mercury value, but here I think these may be the dominant sources that we see in Mountain Hala. So knowing that the sources of mercury zero that we detect in ambient mountain hala are so wide, but the ranges of PBM are much narrow, we can speculate that only certain mercury sources undergo preferential oxidation to form PBM and undergo deposition to the snowpack in mountain hala. Before trying to nail down the sources that are preferentially oxidized and to form PBM, something that we wanted to characterize is where is this oxidation taking place, right? So this is the one that I've labeled as the tropospheric oxidation versus near surface oxidation, where we have this variation in 204 and 200 mercury values, right? So if we assume again that there's near surface oxidation, just like the AMD cycle, we're going to have all the PBMs or snow that plot over at this negative 200 mercury value. If everything undergoes tropospheric photooxidation, we're going to start to see values that are much more elevated. Really interestingly, all the snow samples and PBM samples that we collected from Mountain Hala over the past 4 years plotted on more elevated 200 mercury values, suggesting that the dominant oxidation processes that are taking place is in the troposphere. These are, in comparison, these two circles are the snowpack collected from the Arctic during AMD season. And these are the orange diamonds are the PBMs that were sampled in the Arctic during AMD as well. So you can see that they're very depleted, showing that the oxidation occurs only a few meters above the snow. Also, really interestingly, you et al. Published a paper in 2022 by sampling particulate bound mercury just at the marine boundary layer around the Yellow Sea and East China Sea. So these were some of his transect. So this is just to get you oriented. This is Jeju Island. This is South Korea. And this is where his cruise was taking place. But basically, when they sampled PBM at the marine boundary layer near our site, he observed 200 values that were intermediate between the Arctic region and our high altitude region, which shows that 200 mercury values indeed increases with the elevation at which mercury is being oxidized. And this is a really interesting finding because, again, the notion that these even mass number isotopes fractionate significantly in the troposphere was more of a hypothesis or speculation, which we collected or compiled from existing data set. So having seen this pattern with elevation at a similar site is basically confirming that we can use 200 mercury values to understand where mercury oxidation may be taking place. We've also, this is sort of in the working progress, but I've basically plotted 200 mercury values against the height at which air masses have originated using the high split trajectory. So this is, again, the PBMs that were sampled at the marine boundary layer of East Sea. And these are all the snow and PBM samples which we sampled in Mountain Hala. You can see that, and this is basically the height of the marine boundary layer during daytime and nighttime of our sampling location. But you can see that as soon as it crosses, or the air mass which have originated crosses the marine boundary layer height and enters the troposphere, we start to get this really elevated 200 mercury values relative to the PBM that was sampled at the lower elevation and which has a lower air mass origin. So I think obviously we'll have to run more high split to see whether we can resolve some of these distinctions or some of these distinctions in 200 Mercury variations by air mass directions, whether there are any differences with the percent duration above the marine boundary layer height. But this is something that we're hoping to resolve further to better understand the utility of this CAP 200 Mercury value. Going into the sources of PBM now. So we're going back to the plot of 202 versus 199 here. So again, and these are the PBM samples which we collected at Mountain Hala. What we saw as a pretty clear distinction is that some of the samples had pretty elevated 199 mercury values, and some samples had a little bit depleted 199 mercury values. The samples that are plotted as a background here are the PBMs that were sampled similarly at a high altitude site. So this is the PBM from Pic du Midi in France and some PBM that were sampled at the marine boundary layer of the East Sea. But you can, what has been speculated that is when PBM has elevated 199 mercury values, it's basically reflecting this process of photo reduction on particles. And also because most of these samples have sources that are reflecting mixtures of anthropogenic as well as background mercury, we speculate that some of the PBM that which we detect in Mountain Hala are the mixtures of anthropogenic and background mercury that have bound to particles and underwent some extent of photoreduction. The PBMs that were sampled in the Arctic during AMD season all plot at more negative values in 199. And this is basically because when mercury undergoes photoreduction in the snowpack, basically, which will plot highly in a highly negative value towards -4, whatever mercury that is re-emitted from the snowpack tends to also have very negative 199 mercury values. And any of those sources that binds with the particles will preserve that negativity. And that's something that we seem to also detect in the in the PBM samples in Mountain Hala. The question that we have so far is that whether once mercury is evaded from the snowpack in Mountain Hala, does it undergo in situ absorption or photooxidation since we are located at a free troposphere, or does it undergo transport all the way to the tropopause before it gets being photooxidized? And that's something that we haven't been able to distinguish yet, but it seems that we get some mercury sources that are evaded from snow that is also preferentially undergoing oxidation as PBM. Um, Last but not least, in addition to mercury stable isotope measurement, we've actually requested for measurement of oxygen and nitrogen isotopes in nitrate of Mountain Hala snow. And thanks to Joel Savarino at CNRS, who's been willing to measure some of the samples for us. What we found was that the slope for delta 18O and delta 17O, which is used to determine the nitrate pathways in the Arctic, seems to be comparable to what Joel has observed during the springtime in the Arctic. So here, basically, using this slope of delta 17O versus delta 18O, what he has suggested is that when you have a slope of 0.8 or 0.9, this is indicating that nitrate pathway is induced by bromine oxide, basically, and that's where we get a relatively elevated slope. When nitrate is subject to oxidation pathways via OH or NO3 during summer and winter time, you get more depleted slope, basically. And this is how you can sort of determine the nitrate pathways in the Arctic. But our Mountain Hala slope had a consistent slope with the Arctic. when nitrate pathway is intervened by bromine oxide. And what we speculate at the moment is that these bromines may play an important role even for mercury oxidation in the troposphere based on some of the results that we've compiled so far. So let's check the time. So okay, so that was that flew, the time flew, but this is just a conclusion slash moving forward slide. So there's still much work to be done, but what we know for now is that mountain hollow snow, obviously their mercury concentrations, the isotope values, and fluxes from the snow are very comparable with the Arctic. Some of the differences that we've been able to identify is that there are various mercury sources that are coming into the mountain halosite, including the mixtures of anthropogenic and background sources. And oxidation seems to happen preferentially in the troposphere rather than at the near surface environment, near the snowpack. Unfortunately, most of mercury isotope data in the Arctic come during this AMD event, right? So there's very little comparisons that we can make with our mountain hala data with the Arctic environment during non-polar sunrise season, which makes it difficult to see how comparable our results are with the Arctic. But what we foresee is that if we have the opportunity to conduct seasonal measurements of mercury isotopes in the Arctic, it can provide a really valuable information of mercury sources that are coming through in the atmosphere, as well as sources that are entering the snowpack, which we can utilize the CAP 199 mercury values to look at the reactive surface uptake processes or photoreduction processes. And also, we can determine relative oxidation that may be occurring at the near surface environment versus in the troposphere. And that's something that we're hoping to explore in the future, in the near future, now that we can actually visit the Arctic environment. So that's it for today's talk. I'm happy to address any of your questions.
Thank you very much, Sae, for this great presentation. If you have questions, please raise your hand. And if you don't mind turning on your video, that's possible. I think it's always nice. It's better to see some faces for a nice conversation. Do we have questions? Yes, Kenjiro, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I think I turned on my video as well. And okay, thank you for the talk. I actually missed the first 10 minutes of your talk, sorry. But so I believe Mount Hara is in the Jeju Island, the kind of the high mountain area, right?
Yes.
And you seems to have shown the bromide concentration from the snow sampled
Yeah.
from Mount Hara as well, and does it indicate the relatively high activity of bromine chemistry, at least locally at the Mount Hara? Do you
Well,
do you agree with that?
Well, we speculate that maybe bromine may be playing an important role as an oxidant, but we haven't been able to actually characterize bromine in the atmosphere. These are the measurements in the snow, and what we
Yeah.
find so far is that they're comparable. The concentrations of bromine is comparable with the Arctic environment.
Okay. All right. So what is the height of the sampling? Is it above 1,000 or above? You're kind of referring to this site as a free tropospheric site. So it's not very
Right.
close to the sea surface.
So the marine boundary layer height is approximately 1,100 meters. Here, I have a slide on that. So that was the first slide.
Okay.
So this is the marine boundary layer height is basically this. So 1.1 kilometer. The troposphere is thought that it extends up to 11 kilometers at this particular site. Most of our snow were sampled, and as well as PBM and mercury zero were sampled above the marine boundary layer height. And this is the exact height where we conducted most of the sampling, so 1,700 meters.
Okay, I see. Okay. Now I'm understanding the situation better. Okay. Uh, and there has not been any uh, ground-based optical measurements of bromine radical chemistry in the atmosphere at Jeju Island or at this
Oh, that is
mountain
my
site, like
wish.
Max doors,
Oh,
or
yeah.
things like that. Never happened.
Oh, no, it happened, but then it blew away.
Oh, really? Okay,
Yeah. I
I
wish
see.
I really, really had that data, but we installed Maxdoors next to Techran, and it unfortunately it gets pretty windy in the winter, and it blew away,
Uh-huh.
so we couldn't establish any of those measurements.
I see. So
Yeah,
this link is still kind of speculative.
exactly. And we try to make up for that by measuring the oxygen isotopes in the snow.
Hmm, I see.
Basically to see whether bromine oxide plays a relatively important role, even for mercury.
Hmm, I see. And it's basically a seasonal snowpack. It's not perennial. So it's kind of
Mm.
melts away in in the summertime.
That's
And then
correct. Hmm. So
and
we have three. Hmm.
and even in the midwinter you have sunlight, so there could be some kind of photo activities going on even in the midwinter.
That's right.
At
That's
this,
right. So,
okay.
so we conducted some flux measurements following the diurnal cycle as well, and the pattern looks very nice. So these are the fluxes that we measured with TechCran for
Mm,
mercury, and then the background, the pink is the solar radiation. So you
mm,
can see that it follows that diurnal cycle pretty well. And there are
mm,
fluxes. There's a little deviation here and there, but essentially we get a lot of the re-emissions when there is a presence of sunlight.
okay, I see. Okay. Yeah, my other question is that the the diagram showing the different, fractionation, like a lot of arrows you showed, and from the paper by Bramero, or yeah, this diagram,
Hmm.
So depending on the type, mm, substrate where the photoreduction is occurring, like the orange arrows for the aqueous
Hmm.
photochemical reduction, maybe that represent the cloud water or something. And that actually gives the quite different, fractionation as compared to snow photochemical reduction. Do, do you know why this happens that way, or
That's a good
is there
question.
any fundamental difference in the what's really happening inside cloud water or in the snow? There could be some fundamental difference in the chemical
Unfortunately,
processes.
yeah, we haven't been able to nail down the fundamental processes yet. So there has been a lot of experiments on this area, the aqueous photoreduction. So this is, if you have, this occurs not just in cloud water, it could,
Hmm.
but it also any like fresh water, lake water, ocean water, everything
Oh, really?
will undergo this process. So it's very prevalent in the environment. So, for example, fish will also have very elevated 199 because mercury enters the ocean, undergoes photoreduction degradation, and then gets biomagnified, right? So
Mm,
this is pretty prevalent, but then the snow structure, I don't know if it's a physical, we speculate it's most likely the physical structure that is different with the aqueous phase that initiates different process of photoreduction. This is something that we're hoping to explore further using
okay,
experimental study, but obviously keeping snow is very difficult too.
okay. In the Arctic, photochemical reduction also kind of magnifies at the time of the snow melt. So that means that type of photoreduction may be happening in the meltwater portion of the snow, not exactly the kind
No,
of
not
frozen
in the
snow.
meltwater. So when we did a chamber experiment, what was really interesting is we had one of pretty warm days. So in the
Mm,
chamber, we put snow, we close it, and then we circulate clean air through, and then the natural photo reduction will start to evade mercury zero out, and we're collecting mercury that came out of the chamber and also mercury that has underwent photo reduction within this chamber, right? And
okay.
what happened is that generally we get this negative 199, but when days get little warmer and the snow starts to melt a little bit, then we
Yeah.
start to get elevated 199 value. So it converts
Okay.
pretty quickly from snow phase to aqueous phase.
Okay. I see. So after the snow melt, this fractionation occurs as aqueous phase pathway rather than the sort of the typical
Exactly.
snow pathways. Okay. Thank you very much.
Right.
Interesting. So,
Any other questions from the group?
What's the next step? Do you still have measurements ongoing on Mountain Isla? Or are you done?
No, not. I'm hoping to go back in one winter. So FYI, the whole project we did it without funding. Um, so it's put a lot of pressure on our lab for the past 4 years. So I'm using this results as basis or as publication. We're hoping to attract funders, I guess, interest in studying mercury, atmospheric mercury in Mountain Hala. So, and then go back to install Techrin as well as MaxTOS to see whether we can also nail down the main oxidants that may be playing an important role. The whole project is going in a little odd direction now. I think this is something that we're hoping to figure out in more detail. So here, I think in order for 200 mercury values to be utilized as a really powerful and valuable tracer, even in the Arctic, we're hoping to resolve what causes further variation in 200 values. So here we first, I mean, it's very interesting. We found a clear distinction between when oxidation occurs below the marine boundary layer versus above in the free troposphere. So even this is the first observation so far. And then any further deviation from here, I think we'll have to look through the duration of air masses that were spent above the marine boundary layer, the time of duration that is spent, right? Or air mass directions to see whether even oxidants may play an important role, any anthropogenic or ocean-driven oxidants may partially explain this variation.
That's
So
actually something I was wondering. Do you expect a different signature depending on the oxidant?
that's a really good question. No, I'm gonna say
No.
no. Yeah, but it's gonna require further work though,
And
I
I
think.
was wondering as well, can you tell the difference? Is there any difference in the isotopic signature or elsewhere, whether the oxidant is coming from a natural source or from anthropogenic emissions?
Right. I don't think there will be difference so you're probably talking about like anthropogenic bromine
Yeah.
versus like yeah,
Yeah,
natural.
that's something I'm wondering. Is it coming from
Right.
China
So
or is it from the marine boundary layer?
right. So what my intuition, without any evidence to back this up, is that it's not going to be dependent on the
Hmm.
oxidant or the source of oxidant, but more so on the duration of air
Duration.
mass that it's spent in the troposphere or even higher, for example, in the stratosphere.
Hmm.
So that's
Yeah,
something that there was one experimental studies where when they induced UVC light, there was a crazy fractionation of cap 200 values. And I think that may be the one that is most viable explanation, but there hasn't been any observational studies on that.
Mm.
last phase
So
chemical oxidation is a multi-step process. So initially, mercury zero will be sort of associated with bromine or chlorine atoms or OH radicals. That has to be further, associated with something else like ozone or NO2 to
Mm.
get to the divalent state. So that
right.
so that depending on the concentration of particularly NO2, concentration can vary significantly, between the rural or clean air mass and the polluted or, emission influenced air
Okay.
masses, so that this pathway can be significantly different. So ozone may be almost always present to some extent in the troposphere, and in the stratosphere it's even much higher. And the involvement of NO2 may be
Yeah,
significant
NOx.
different, so
Mm-hmm.
that could, sort of magnify the sort of the signature from the, mercury emission co-emitted with the NOx, like power plant.
Mm.
So
Right.
that
That's a
might potentially explain something.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. No, an interesting comment, and that's worth exploring. It's definitely not a one-step process, and that may also interfere with the fractionation. And yeah, I'll definitely check the air mass directions to see whether it may be relevant too. Because we saw that sometimes air masses will come from China versus
Mm.
the ocean region, and then even across the China, I mean, sometimes it originates from far north or from the west side, so that may cause some variation too.
But
Yeah,
that's an exciting data set.
it is. It
Yeah.
is going in a really odd direction, but
Yeah.
it's
Any last minute burning question before we say goodbye to Sai? Anyone? No? Well, thank you so much everyone for joining, and thanks again, Sai, for this discussion, and looking forward to the papers now.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was really fun, and thanks for asking questions actively.